Hello, and welcome to Speak Up for Our Planet. All the recordings you find on this channel are of specific environmental topics. The speakers illustrate and explain their subject and are open to questions from the audience. If you'd like to join us live, please visit our website and click Join Us. Hope to see you soon. Over to you.
Thank you, Jane. We're welcoming Mark here today. Mark left university after studying chemical engineering and joined BP in 1984. Now, I know this is going to make me sound ridiculous, but I tried to work out how long ago that was. And sorry, Mark, it was 42 years ago.
Yes.
We were all babies 42 years ago, but that's a different thing. Then had a 25-year career with BP, where he had various roles in operations and commercial spheres, including alternative energy. So that's all good. In 2010, he left because they disbanded their alternative energy business. Seemed fair enough, really. Number of consulting roles, and then joined GasRec in 2016. So again, quite a chunk of time ago, really, isn't it? And then you were doing a project director then, of course. In 2022, he became COO, looking at leadership, working with the leadership team for investment and growth of the business, which I think is, in this day and age, actually is quite difficult, isn't it? I mean, if you went back 10 or 20 years ago, there seemed to be more money just looking around. And now actually raising money for businesses is difficult, isn't it? As I'm sure you're finding. I'm so sorry, taking that. Mark, over to you, sir.
I'll talk through these few slides, and then again, we'll come to questions earlier. So yeah, I'm GasRec COO, worked for GasRec for about 10 years now, as Sarah mentioned. Leaving diesel behind is our strapline. And the reason for the cow is a lot of the decarbonising aspect of this particular talk is related to sort of biomethane, and cows are one of the sources of biomethane. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the UK transport emissions, give it some context, some of the options that we have in transport for decarbonising. What is biomethane? How does it relate to diesel? A bit more about biomethane. Again, we can get into more or less detail. Then the supply chain, which is basically what I work with GasRec and what we do, and then how GasRec has evolved as a company, and it can be quite a tortuous journey. These things don't happen easily. So I think it's interesting to look at that and some of the key elements of that, and then also the customers and the customer base. Is critical for a business to survive. And we've got a range of customers who are participating for various reasons. And again, I think that gives an insight into how industries like this, particularly in the sort of sustainable and decarbonisation area, arise. So UK transport emissions, very, very rough sort of numbers. About 30% of the UK emissions come from transport. 18 to 20% are HGV. So in total, heavy goods transport counts for about 5% of the total emissions, which doesn't sound a huge amount, but if you think that electricity production is 10%, it's not insignificant. And also diesel emissions, not necessarily strictly speaking CO2, but also they also emit NOx. They also emit particulates, which contributes to local air quality. So there's both a sort of a global aspect to this in terms of the CO2, but also the local air quality is quite significant because the heavy goods vehicles don't just stay on the motorways; they will come into towns, and the pollution ends up there. So what are the options for carbonisation? Now, a very important part of this is the fact that in order to get after decarbonisation, you ideally want a market that's ready and willing and interested in accepting it and taking it on. So when we look at the heavy vehicle market, it's the very, very small margins, tiny margins. So these companies that run vehicles, they need to be able to refuel relatively conveniently. Even to go sort of 5 kilometers out of their way costs some money, so they prefer not to do that. They want the vehicles to be on the road most of the time, They want any fuel to be cost competitive versus diesel. Diesel is effectively the benchmark. They don't want too much weight restrictions. You need to be able to get as much on a vehicle as you possibly can. Maximizing that makes the most cost efficient way of moving materials around. They're also, again, convenient refueling locations, but also they don't want to be hanging around very long. It takes about 10 minutes, 10 to 12 minutes to refuel a heavy goods vehicle with diesel. Similarly, it does with LNG as well, but much longer than that. And again, the vehicle is off the road, and that causes issues for them. And also, they'd like it to be sustainable if it possibly can. And again, we'll perhaps come to some of the customers and the segments where sustainability is more of an issue. The important thing is it can be as sustainable as you like, but if it isn't cost effective, it won't happen. So that's sort of the main sort of message there. So there are a number of alternatives potentially out there. Look, decarbonisation, EV, so electric is the most significant one. Problems with electric are it needs significant grid reinforcement. By that, what we mean is getting the power to the places where the vehicles can recharge. Also, those batteries that to power an HGV take an awful lot of power, and therefore reinforcing the grid, putting in enough wires that can take that power is very, very expensive. We've had one of our customers doing a study, and they said it was going to cost them something like £4 billion to electrify their whole fleet, not just of HGVs, but vans, etc., and delivery. So grid reinforcement, significant issue. The battery weight is significant, and as we said earlier, there are limits on UK roads as to what weight you can be, and therefore the more you have battery, the less goods you can carry. Therefore, you're basically just carrying around a large weight rather than goods that make you money. And at the moment, EV charging, even for cars, is a reasonable length of time. Certainly, a lot more time than petrol. For EV trucks, it's even more. So we say 10 minutes for a vehicle to refuel. You're looking at several hours for an EV to refuel. Hopefully, battery technology will get better and lighter. But at the moment, there's no real significant breakthrough, and just the fundamentals of the physics of getting the energy density sort of talk against that at the moment. But EV is developing all the time, and eventually electric trucks might get there. Hydrogen is the other fuel that's been talked about. The idea that you burn hydrogen and all that comes out the tailpipe is basically water, which is true. However, hydrogen is not readily available. There are a number of schemes now, although a number have fallen by the wayside recently, to mass produce hydrogen. And even if you could do that, transporting it is very difficult, certainly in the scale that's needed in order to fuel the transport system. It's difficult to make available at point of use. Liquid hydrogen, which is probably the easiest way to transport it around, or the best way, not the easiest, is liquid at minus 253 degrees centigrade, which is very, very cold, very close to absolute zero. And therefore, that contributes to the fact that it costs an awful lot of money, both to build hydrogen refueling stations, and there are a few of them around, but also to maintain them as well. Also, hydrogen does some strange things when you put it into a storage tank. An example, some of those storage tanks need to be coated with special coatings in order to stop the hydrogen from getting out. So it's quite a sensitive system, difficult, but the main issue is just getting enough hydrogen to the point of use in a sensible way. So the other main alternative, and there is one more, but which I'll mention, is biomethane. Now, biomethane is readily available. It's basically natural gas. It's the same thing that powers your cooker and your boilers. The design of the vehicles doesn't change, so you can use standard vehicles. In fact, they're all made on the same production line. They just change the engine design slightly and change the storage tanks for the fuel. The refueling time is comparable, so they stay on the road as much as a diesel vehicle would. And because they're a standard design, there's no additional weight to be carried around. So they fit biomethane fits very, very easily into into the operations that exist. So no significant wider investment in that. The other fuel that you may have heard of is HVO, hydrogenated vegetable oil, which is or biodiesel. That's been discredited quite a lot recently because there was an influx of HVO from China, amongst other places, that couldn't necessarily be verified. HVO at the moment is more expensive than diesel, I think. And also, you can't know from looking at the vehicle whether it's actually diesel or whether it's biodiesel. So the actual control and governance around that is quite difficult. So HVO, both the cost and the lack of sort of an ability to sort of market it clearly, has caused a number of people who were looking at it to move away, because of course you can put it into an existing infrastructure, refueling systems. But that unfortunately has fallen by the wayside. So these are probably the three main protagonists, and biomethane obviously is what I'm going to talk about at the moment. Has a lead, a head start over the other two, certainly at any sort of scale. Just some of the benefits of bio LNG versus diesel. There is a substantial CO2 reduction. It's more with biomethane than fossil fuel, but even with fossil methane, it's still a not insignificant amount. The environment's better. There's no smelly diesel. There's no residues. The noise from diesel from an biomethane engine is lower. You don't lose the payload, which we've talked about. Gas supply is relatively abundant, and biomethane is that goes into the system is derived from weight. The calculations are rather complicated, but biomethane can be demonstrated to reduce CO2 emissions by around about 85%. It depends very much on the fuel. Sometimes it can actually be over 100%. Sometimes it's slightly lower than that, but a good sort of number is about in that sort of 70 to 80 sort of range. 85 is a good number. Biomethane itself, it's renewable gas. It comes from the breaking down basically of organic matter. That's then collected in what's called an anaerobic digester. So basically the bacteria create the methane. It also creates a lot of CO2, ironically, but that CO2 can then be upgraded and cleaned and actually sold, and it's quite a valuable byproduct. You may have read recently that there was suggestions that we'd be running out of CO2, and CO2 is used both in the food and drinks industry, but also in the meat packaging and other areas. So you get both of those products. The biomethane can either go into the grid, into the gas grid, or it can be liquefied. Liquefying it in the UK is very, very expensive, and you would only do it if you had absolutely no other option. So most biomethane in the UK goes into the grid, but we buy most of our biomethane from Europe. Europe is connected to the UK through pipelines, and those pipelines also connect into the LNG terminal. So it's one big system, and that's important for us being able to sort of count the LNG that we take from the Isle of Grain terminal, where LNG is imported from around the world, but we can call it biomethane, and there's a reason for that, which I can talk about a little bit later. But biomethane, there's a lot of investment in biomethane at the moment. A lot of people seeing that as a good industry to be in as well. So this pictorial is what GasRec does. On the left, you've got the Isle of Grain LNG terminal. That's basically importing LNG, liquid natural gas, minus 160 degrees centigrade. UK gets a lot of its gas from the US. It also gets it from Qatar and one or two other locations. Other big producing areas is Australia and obviously the Middle East, as we've all heard about recently, but very large quantities. Most of the gas that goes into the Isle of Grain terminal is actually what we call regassed. It's warmed up, it's treated with various other hydrocarbons, and then it's put into the gas system, and it's what you burn in your boilers and your cookers. So I think it's about 30% of the UK's gas actually comes in through the LNG terminals. Isle of Grain is one. We go to Isle of Grain because it has a road loading capability, which you'll see in the next slide. There are two other terminals in Wales, Dragon and South Hook, and they also import, but all they can do is regas the gas and put it into the natural gas system. So the road tankers, GasRec owns its own road tankers. These are like very large thermos flasks that sit on the back of a lorry. We fill them up at the terminal. We then drive from the Isle of Grain to the various refueling stations that we have. The logistics industry is really congregates around a southeast to northwest corridor, and the Midlands is at the heart of that. And then there are offshoots down in the sort of West Country and also up into the northwest and the northeast as well. But we take all of our tankers. We have about 18 tankers now. We take all of that LNG into the refueling stations. The refueling stations themselves have large tanks, and those tanks are again vacuum insulated to try and keep it warm. By the time the LNG gets to the vehicles, it's probably warmed up by about 20 degrees, but it's still pretty cold. So it's still about minus 140 degrees. GasRec owns the tankers. We build and operate and maintain the refueling stations. We have very close relationships with the OEMs, as we call them, the vehicle manufacturers. 3 main vehicle manufacturers at the moment, Scania and Iveco, who use a certain technology, but Volvo is the main driver at the moment. Most of the vehicles that we see at our stations are Volvo vehicles, and they use a slightly different technology, which does use a small amount of diesel. They're diesel engines, so you need to compress the diesel in order to create the spark, but they are the most efficient, and also they're what the drivers like, and what the drivers like is very important. So this is the complete supply chain. GasRec operates all of that. We sell to the customers, we run and operate the stations, we own the tankers, and we buy LNG from the Isle of Grain. Only a number of people can sell from the Isle of Grain, and we buy primarily through Centrica, who are one of our investors, which we'll come to in a minute. So that's a summary of the supply chain that we see. I've put UK biomethane transport market evolution. GasRec, certainly on the LNG side, is the market. There are other suppliers who supply CNG, compressed natural gas, and then they usually take that from gas pipelines, compress it using big compressors, and then they can put that into vehicles as well. CNG has less energy density in the tanks, so it's more suited to certain types of vehicles. LNG, the energy density is higher, so that tends to be more suited to the heavier goods vehicles. So this is really the timeline of GasRec, but there's also some market elements in there. So it was founded in 2003, but as you'll see, LBM, liquid biomethane, production didn't start for another 8 years or so. These things take a long time. The gestation period is quite long. If anybody's familiar with Albury, we had a plant down there that was taking landfill gas and producing LBM. So that was in 2011. In 2012-13, we built some fueling stations. There's 4 or 5 fueling stations, and those started to run on that LBM. Very, very small numbers of vehicles that were actually dual fuel. There were diesel and biomethane, because people didn't trust they were able to get biomethane, so they wanted something else. Unfortunately, the technology was very, very poor. There was a lot of methane slippage, so the methane was actually getting out the exhaust, which wasn't really great, because it's even worse greenhouse gas than CO2. But there were a number of determined customers, and GasRec at the time, before I joined, was very determined and kept going with the number of stations. In 2014, mass balancing is approved. It sounds like a very technical term. Mass balancing basically meant that we could take LNG from the Isle of Grain terminal, and we can sell it as biomethane. If any of you buy green electricity, the actual electricity you use, you have no idea whether it's green electricity or not. All the electricity effectively goes into the system, and it's credited with a certification system which says, well, if X amount went in and X amount went out, then we can say that we've sold you green electricity. It's the same with biomethane. A lot of biomethane goes into the system. A lot of fossil fuel, not biomethane, goes into the system. But as long as you only sell what you put in, then it's accepted that you can say that you are selling biomethane. So mass balancing, very important for us to show that biomethane was possible in the sale. As I said, dual fuel was slowly falling off. In fact, GasRec sales over the period were reducing. People were stopping using it. Then in 2016, Iveco and Scania committed. And again, you see in the history of this, people taking risk. And effectively, that's what's happening here. In different parts of the chain, for different reasons, they will take risk. GasRec was taking a risk that this business, and its investors particularly, that this business would go. Iveco and Scania saw a potential opportunity, so they started to build trucks. These were spark ignition. They weren't quite as good at performing as the latter Volvo trucks, but still, they were there. They were getting involved in the market and starting to show that these biomethane trucks actually worked. The technology was good. There wasn't methane slip. And so it was starting to gain credibility and gain traction in the marketplace. And again, that's 13 years after GasRec was founded. Volvo came along in 2018 with a different technology, which people did seem to like. And that really started giving people confidence that if Volvo were producing a truck, the truck was good, that they might start to get involved. There's a lot of chicken and egg in this story as well. And it's all about who takes the risk first. So in 2018 to 2022, there was rapid early market growth. We were starting to see the potential. Customers were getting sort of more interested. There was a lot more press, a lot more recognition that this actually was a credible solution. At the same time, a lot of hype around hydrogen and EV, which did delay people investing in biomethane while they learned. And again, customers learn, but they don't learn quickly, and that's no disrespect to them. It just takes a while for an organization to understand that it's going to take a big step in a different direction. How does it get comfortable with that? How does it get comfortable again with the risk? So that tends to slow things down. So a lot of the hydrogen and EV hype, that started to subside away. Now people have looked at it, customers have investigated the alternatives, the costs, the performance of the different vehicles, and saying, well, EV and hydrogen, perhaps they're not quite there yet. We still need and want to decarbonize, so biomethane does present a clear option for us. So after quite a long period of time, BP invests in the company. BP's interest is in trading biomethane. That's their strategic interest in the company. You can't realize the value from trading biomethane unless you're actually putting the biomethane into vehicles. Something called renewable transport fuel certificates is how the government indirectly encourages people to invest in this, and there are other sort of drivers as well. Increasingly, gas was seen as a lower cost to decarbonisation when compared to the alternatives, recognizing that some of those alternatives are not really practical at the moment, but particularly HVO, it competed very well against that. So again, the hauliers who are looking and thinking about, well, I'd like to do this, but I can't destroy my business in the process, starting to see gas as potentially providing an opportunity. Originally, the lower cost of gas versus diesel, and gas is generally costs less than diesel, were the OEMs, the vehicle manufacturers were taking that money. So they were increasing the price of the vehicles so that an operator would see the costs being roughly the same, but the OEMs would be pocketing the money. Recently, that's less the case. There are quotas now in Europe for OEMs to produce a certain number of renewable vehicles, with EV and hydrogen not being there yet. Biomethane is the obvious solution. So then the vehicle manufacturers say, well, if we need to move more volume, perhaps we need to reduce the pricing. So it starts to become more competitive. The prices go down versus or to similar level as diesel truck. And then if the operating costs are lower, then people can see a financial incentive for doing that. So between BP investing, there was a significant amount of growth. We grew the number of stations that we were operating, the number of tankers we were operating, the volume that we were selling. GasRec covenant accepted sounds very dry. Basically, your covenant is your credibility, your credit risk, effectively, and that's very important because you can't get land. Landlords won't lease land to you, which is what we need for our stations, without you having a covenant, i.e., you look relatively low risk. But with BP as an investor, both putting money in, but also their brand, that gives other people confidence. And a lot of this is about confidence. It's not necessarily about hard analytics. A lot of it is, particularly in a growth industry that you don't know where it's going. People look and say, BP, they've invested, they thought about it, they've got some clever people, they must have decided it was a good idea. Perhaps now we'll take more risk on it. So once that covenant was accepted, once our credit was seen to be more acceptable, that opened a number of doors, both with customers who previously were a bit uncertain about what to do, but also with other investors. And in 2025, last year, middle of last year, Centrica invested. Now, Centrica are a big gas provider in the UK. They are investing primarily to see where this business goes, because this could be a long-term, a major use for gas, and therefore it interests them. A small investment just to see how things go, and that's what investors will do. They'll make a small investment so it doesn't expose them too much to risk, but it will help that business move to the next stage, which is what the investments of BP and Centrica are doing for GasRec. And so at the moment, we are looking to invest in a number of new stations around the country. And as you were sort of mentioning earlier, it's a constant need to secure additional funding. If you're going to grow, you need more money, you need more people, you're going to need to buy raw materials. All of that takes cash. And without that, without cash flow, businesses can't survive. So you need the investors either taking a risk or recognizing that perhaps it's a lower return initially, and then that return will grow through time. Of course, BP and Centrica both have wider strategic interests, so we'll also make money elsewhere in the value chain. But from 2003 to 2025, and we're still in a very, very small early stage business or industry. It takes a long time and a lot of effort to get these things up and running. The customers that we have today are mainly these brands. We have others customers, but these are the brands that I thought that you'd recognize. The reason that they're in, they have a very strong sustainability agendas, so they're talking directly to the public and want to demonstrate that. Also, most of these operate what we call a back to base. There aren't that many LNG stations around. If one station goes down, you can't just go down the road to another one. So back to base means that you have a refueling station, you refuel, you go out, do your deliveries, then you come back and you refuel again, and you're reasonably certain that it'll be there when you get home. A number of these people have refueling stations on their sites. B&Q particularly, Tesco also do, Sainsbury's did but don't have any more, or perhaps they do still. And then we're building at DHL. We've got a Rebordle. Asda are a really, really big supporter of biomethane and are heavily involved. And indeed, John Lewis, not directly one of our customers, they go for CNG rather than LNG, but John Lewis have been a big supporter over the years as well. And you need these people, you need individuals almost within these companies to really support biomethane. They have options that can go in different directions. So it does come down to individuals within these big companies who will actually drive things forward. Someone coming new into a job saying, yeah, no, I believe in this. Let's make the case. Let's put it to the board. Let's take it forward. However, whilst these are the big brands and you know about them, they're really a very small proportion, or relatively small proportion, of the overall HGV market. The big market that's out there is big distribution companies. What they need is a network of stations. They need stations that they can send a guy or a gal out on a Monday morning and they don't come home until Friday, and they tramp all around the UK, and they've got to be able to refuel wherever they can. And at the moment, we don't have a network of LNG and CNG stations out there for them to do that. But once we do, and that's the current plan for GasRec, people like Great Bear, Kalina, Maritime, they have huge fleets, and then the industry will take another major step forward when those type of customers get involved. So you start with the customers who are interested, you start with the customers who have drivers which align with the industry and where it is at the time, and then you look for the big prize as you go forward. And we know that these big companies, if we could provide the network, would start to switch over to LNG. There's an economic incentive for them, even if their sustainability approach is not as strong. If we can demonstrate the economics are better than diesel and the indirect support that we get from governments, then they will actually move over to that. So there's a huge potential for sort of growth in the industry here. He didn't get away without it. This is a LNG truck. It's actually a Volvo truck. You can see the cylindrical, silver cylindrical. That's the thermos flask, effectively, that the LNG goes into. But other than that, not that you'll be familiar with the design of HGVs, other than that, most of the rest of what's on there is pretty much what you'll see on any diesel heavy goods vehicle. It's really just the tank. So if you're driving down the road now and you see a vehicle, an Asda truck or a Tesco truck with that big silver cylinder on the side, that will be an LNG vehicle, and more than not likely not a biomethane vehicle. And back to the cow. So that's
Thank
it.
you. Thank you very much. There are already questions piling in. So between Sarah and me, we will feed you some questions.
Good. Right, I've got you back.
Let's go with. So Rosie says, are your LNG tankers fueled by biomethane?
Some of them are, some of them aren't. We'd like that they all were fueled by biomethane. Unfortunately, vehicles don't work the way you'd like. Things break down, etc., etc. So you have to have a backup, and our backup is diesel. As the market grows, increasingly you'll be able to do it and get LNG vehicles. So I think about half or a little bit more than that of the tankers that we use are LNG. We work with partners very often. So we work with a logistics provider, and they operate, as it were, the vehicles. So they actually own the tractor units. We own the tankers that go on the back. But yes, a number of them are LNG vehicle fueled vehicles.
Thank you. There's a question here that I'm going to ask now, even though it's by no means the first one to have been asked, because I think it may be in several people's heads. Alan says, I'm confused. What's the difference between biomethane and LNG? And don't we import LNG?
Yes, we do import LNG. The Isle of Grain terminal is one of the import for LNG, and the two terminals in Wales are the other two. LNG is liquefied natural gas. It's liquefied methane. It's methane that's been cooled down to about minus 160 degrees centigrade. The reason for doing that is that if you want to transport gas, usually is found in very remote places where no one wants to use it. And if you want to use it, you need to put it somewhere. You need to take it somewhere. Pipelines is one route to do it, but pipelines are very expensive and very inflexible. So large producers of methane decided to liquefy it, put it on ships, and send those ships around the world, rather like any other commodity such as oil. So LNG is usually a fossil fuel. It's a natural gas that comes out of the ground, is liquefied, and then is transported around. Biomethane chemically is pretty much the same. It's pretty much methane. It's slightly different chemically, but fundamentally it's in the 90s, high 90s% methane. So LNG, as it's imported, is a fossil fuel, and biomethane is, as it suggests, a bio sort of fuel. And it's the mass balancing that allows you to sell biomethane, even though the physical molecule may be fossil fuel. mass balancing is very people we talk to, they struggle with mass balancing with natural gas, but they're very happy to accept mass balancing for green electricity. You know, you have no idea where the windmill that's outside your window is still producing electricity that just goes into the grid and no one knows where it ends up. So mass balancing is the connection between imported fossil LNG and biomethane. Biomethane is produced in the UK. There are multiple sites, but they're all very, very small scale. But it's also produced in quite large quantities in Europe. And as I said earlier, the gas grids between Europe and the UK are all connected together. We also get gas from Norway as well. That's another big importer of gas, as well as still some coming from the North Sea, although a lot less than there used to be. Hope that helps.
Right. Yes. More complicated than it at first appears, like many things.
Yes.
So Ian asks, what are governments doing to incentivize biomethane and decarbonisation of heavy transport?
So in the early days, there were some European grants to build LNG stations. Unfortunately, when governments give you money, it's never just for free. You have to do a lot of reporting. You do a lot of calculations, and small businesses putting in resources to do that, to get the money, it wastes quite a lot of the money. So that's not necessarily helpful. In the UK, the road tax that hauliers pay is half, I believe it's half for an LNG or gas vehicle than it is for a diesel vehicle. So there is some incentive there. There's a reduction. Indirectly, what governments are doing, mainly sort of in Europe, is they're saying to the vehicle manufacturers, you need to produce a certain proportion of vehicles which are sustainable. And therefore, and if you don't, we will fine you. So that's puts an additional cost on them if they don't do that. So they say, oh, well, we need to move some of these vehicles. So let's reduce the cost of the vehicle. This is very crudely speaking. Let's reduce the cost of the vehicle so people will buy it. So they indirectly support it in that way. The other way is RTFCs, Renewable Transport Fuel Certificates. So again, this is the government mandating that people who produce fossil fuel, like BP and others, have to either supply a certain amount of biomethane, or they have to buy credits, which is these RTFCs, which are generated from companies like us. And what that does is that produces a potential revenue stream. The problem with that is that it's very much a commodity and the price moves around, so you can't guarantee it. In fact, at the moment, RTFC prices are very low because the price of oil is very high. There's an inverse relationship there. So whereas last year we got a reasonable amount of income from RTFCs, this year we're getting less income from RTFCs. To be honest, I think if you can find market mechanisms like that, small incentives that move people in that general direction, it's probably more sustainable than great big subsidies from government. Sometimes you do need that. But I've worked in a number of renewable areas such as carbon capture and storage and solar power. And as soon as it becomes successful, the governments withdraw the funding. And at that point, you lose an awful lot of people. So if you can find an arrangement that allows something to compete in the marketplace without completely underpinning it, then it's more likely, I would say, to succeed in the longer term. So yeah, there are nudges in the right direction, which I think fine works for us. One of the reasons I joined GasRec was because I'd worked in those other areas and I realized that it didn't need subsidies in order for biomethane to be a business of its own. So, but yes, there is support. It's not direct support, and you can argue whether that's good or bad. I would argue that it's good.
Thank you. Okay, a question about the market. How big is the potential size of the market? And then I think a slightly tongue-in-cheek end to the question, if you've got every cow in the country involved in biomethane.
The problem with the biomethane produced sort of locally is it's all small scale. I mean, it's not quite sort of mom and pop as the Americans would say, but it's literally farmers or it's food waste or this type of thing. It's relative to the scale of the amount of that we use. It's sort of relatively small. But and again, this is where you need the market. So when there's a market for biomethane, which there is, if there's a market for transport, then people will convert that their waste into biomethane and make it more sense. Some people, like Arla, the dairy, are looking to create a completely circular. So their cows produce the milk, the cows produce the methane, they take the methane, it gets turned, we sell to them as well, but they get biomethane. That biomethane is then used to transport the milk around. So it's nice and circular. People like Sainsbury's are looking to use food waste to generate biomethane and then buy that sort of biomethane back. So people are looking to do that on a small scale. If it really took off, I mean, I can't remember exactly the numbers, something like 120,000 new HGV registrations in the UK each year. If it really took off, then it may challenge biomethane. But if it really takes off and there's a real big market for biomethane, then people will invest more in biomethane. Then you'll get into potentially food versus fuel type of arguments and discussions. And then really you're looking to balance the different sort of risks that each of those sort of opportunities provide. So it's one of those problems that, as we say, that'll be a lovely problem to have in the future. Right now, we've got plenty of other problems just to get the industry up and running. So longer term, yes, but longer term is probably about 5+ years away before that starts to become an issue.
So I have two questions from Catherine, both of which I think you've partly answered. So I'm just going to read them out. Where is biomethane produced in the UK? You've kind of said all over the place in lots of little places, but maybe you can expand on that a bit. And the other one is, do you see a time when LNG is completely replaced by biomethane? So when natural gas becomes all non-fossil? So you've sort of touched on both of those questions.
Yeah, it's so in terms of production in the UK, it was one of the slides that didn't make the cut. But there's basically a map that's got lots and lots and lots and lots of red dots all over it. Originally, there was a thing called the Renewable Heat Initiative, which was basically, again, getting people to produce methane, biomethane, and put it into the grid so that we could burn it in our boilers and in our cookers. And that took an awful lot, and still does take an awful lot of support for natural gas. And so that goes directly into the pipeline. And that's really what set up and started a lot of these sort of smaller biomethane sort of production, or it was one of the support mechanisms that did that. So it's all over the UK. Is it ever going to replace natural gas? Probably not in my lifetime. But if we can focus a lot of it into heat and if we can focus a lot of it into transport, there's probably enough to be able to take substantial chunks out of the emissions from those particular areas. And the thing about transport is, as I tried to explain earlier, perhaps not very well, there are limited options to decarbonize the transport sector, right? Power stations are quite big. You can potentially do carbon capture and all sorts of things. You know where the power stations are, they don't move around. The trucks do move around. There's lots of them. They're all over the place. Some of them are new, some of them are old, etc. So actually targeting the transport sector, particularly the heavy goods transport sector, has been one of those things. Oh, it's just too difficult. It's just too difficult. Biomethane actually now increasingly, and people are hopefully sort of saying this, it's now a credible way to do it. It's a credible way. It's an economic way. It's a practical way. We're all very familiar with natural gas. We've dealt with it for years and years and years since they converted from town gas in the 60s or 70s or whenever it was. So it's something that people are familiar with, industry's familiar with, the health and safety executive who regulate our industry are familiar with. All of those things just make people feel comfortable. All of those things have to add up. Lots of little things add up to get people into the right place to think, this is good. And as I mentioned earlier, to take the risk. Chicken and egg. customers will invest when you can demonstrate that the station's going to be there, and you'll invest in the station when you know the customers are going to be there. So how do you get there? So someone's got to take a risk at some point. It's usually people like GasRec and GasRec's investors. They take a risk and they say, well, we think it sort of makes sense and it'll work. So here's some money, build some stations and hope that people will come. It's not field of dreams, build and hope. We do a lot of work behind the scenes to get the customers and to load stations up and to get commitments, etc. But you are still dealing with the chicken and egg. You are still with both sides still sort of moving forward. So it's a dynamic you don't see that often. Normally we're used to businesses that are up and running and standard. So it takes quite a lot of sort of time and effort to build those relationships, to build that confidence, to encourage people to take risk. It's fundamentally what's going on here, whether it's customers or investors, etc. I'll risk my money because I think it's going to be better and I'm going to make more money in the future. And that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, story of dogged determination. Sarah wants to know, it's something which is a little bit more to do with you and the business rather than the market. What has been the biggest misconception you've encountered when talking to fleet operators about environmental sustainability? And what evidence has most successfully changed their minds?
Well, they're all people and they're all different and they all have different drivers to do that. I think the biggest issue is not being necessarily the individuals who can, as an individual, see the benefits of biomethane. If they look to understand it and etc., they can see it. The barrier is then getting it through the business. And again, that's not because the business doesn't want to do it, but in order to get decisions made, a lot of people have got to be on board. The HSE people need to be consultant. The commercial people need to be on board. The directors, oh, I've heard about this LNG stuff. Someone down the road had a truck and it didn't work, so I'm not buying any. So you get a lot of that sort of hearsay and whatever. So the biggest sort of issue is the education, the understanding of what it is and what it means. What does it mean to have an LNG station on your site? You've told me it's minus 160 degrees centigrade. Isn't that rather dangerous? You've told me it's natural gas. One thing about LNG, 1 cubic centimeter, when you take it out of the tank, expands to about 600 cubic centimeters. So the stuff needs careful management, etc. When you're good at it, when you know what you're doing, you can manage it. Nothing's ever risk-free, but you can do it. But people don't understand. They don't understand. I worked at BP for a long while in the power business. BP would sort of over a coffee break invest several $1 billion in Azerbaijan, but power they could never get their heads around because it wasn't in their DNA, as BP used to say. Just wasn't something that business understood intrinsically. And it's the same with these businesses. LNG is new, it's different, they don't understand it. So you need to spend an awful lot of time trying to explain and demonstrate both the financial benefits, the sustainability benefits, which are relatively straightforward, and that process takes a long time. So that change, that culture change, if you want to, is probably the biggest sort of barrier, because when an individual sits down, looks at it and does the numbers and thinks about it, yeah, absolutely, this makes sense. How you get that through a sort of a corporate structure is difficult. So we deal with a lot of small family companies and they make decisions very quickly. Yeah, we're going to do this, move on. But that's like 10, 20, 30 trucks. That's not going to move the industry, but it's great that they do. And they're taking a big risk because they are small, but the owner has decided I'm going to do this. So he does it. Mainly it's he, and less she.
Yeah, interesting. The board is always going to be a difficult thing to get these things passed, but still you're getting there.
Yes.
Okay. A question that interests me too. Eddie says, BP has stepped sharply away from sustainable energy to focus on fossil fuels. How has this affected you?
Well, it hasn't. You've got to read the small print at the moment. So BP is now what they call simplifying the business. So they've got upstream and downstream now, which basically means the drilling it out the ground and then the refining it and selling it to the petrol. In the background, not often talked about, they have a trading arm. They trade products. oil products, gas products, etc. And the part of BP that's invested in us, and BP itself doesn't invest, individual businesses within it do. The part of that's invested in us is the trading business. And the trading business appears to be wholly unaffected by the changes that have gone on. And they are interested specifically in biomethane. They trade natural gas, yes, obviously, but here is a new market where they're trying to take a lead, take a position, so it fits very neatly with their existing hydrocarbon strategy. It sort of fits in between the sustainable energy piece, which I was very much sort of involved in. Again, very difficult. The DNA, the understanding, the senior board members, the people who've been in the industry for 10, 20, 30 years don't intrinsically understand the business. And there's a lot of arguments about, focus on your knitting and that type of thing, which is what's winning out at the moment. And also what we've also found is people say, oh, well, a big company starts to do biomethane, they'll just blow you out of the water. They can easily just spend the money, I've worked in a big company. It's really difficult for them to find their way to invest in small new things and manage it without completely and utterly destroying it. So actually, I'm less worried about a big company. If they can come in and buy us, I mean, that's what they can do. And even then they can manage to destroy you. But in terms of competing, it's very difficult. A lot of bright people, a lot of money doesn't necessarily mean success.
So, and finally, a very Speak Up for Our Planet oriented question. Are there any things that we can do as individuals, as members of Speak Up for Our Planet, to influence the adoption of biomethane?
Well, unless you run a transport company, no, there's a limited amount. You can be like the kid at the end of Camelot, and you can run around and tell people the story and tell them what we're doing. When they say, oh, that's LPG, it's not LPG, it's not liquid petroleum gas, it's LNG, it's biomethane. We've spent, certainly one of my colleagues, Chief Commercial Officer James, he's been with the business 12, 13 years now, and he spent more than half of that time simply knocking on doors and trying to tell the story to people. And now, slowly, the story is getting through. So, and it gets through in strange ways. It gets through in different ways. Someone's wife hears it, they talk to their husband takes it to work. Oh yes, that would be interesting, wouldn't it? Now that's no way to run a business, no way to grow a business. But individuals, if you talk about it, if you have credibility, if you understand it a little bit more than you did an hour and a half ago, then you also know, if someone asks you a question, go to GasRec, www.gasrec.co.uk, and have a look at them. They're doing biomethane. Or call Mark Siddle, his number's probably on there somewhere, or you can probably Google it. We're willing to talk to anybody because spreading the word, making people aware, helping them understand, helping them make their own decisions. At the end of the day, they'll say it is for me or it's not for me, but we try very hard to explain to them why it should be for them. So I think for this particular one, yes, it's really just spread the word, let people know that you've heard about it, and that actually it sounds as though it might be something that would make a difference.
Yeah, well, there you are. See, that's what we're good at. We talk to people and spread word. And I've learned how to spot a vehicle which has got the big silver cylinder. So you see, we can tell people, you've just spotted an LNG vehicle. So it's the kind of thing that, you never know when it's going to come up over dinner.
Our office is in Clapham Junction, and right next to our office there's a huge Asda store, and down the road between us and the Asda store we see the LNG truck driving 2-3 times a day to make deliveries. So it's sort of one of those perverse twists of fate, but yes, so we get to sit and watch. Even in London office we get to see and watch the LNG trucks doing their thing, which is great.
Brilliant. That must be good for morale. So you see it actually happening.
It's a bit sad when grown people rush to the window looking at a tank that's got a small silver thermos flask on the side. But yes, you know, you get enthused about your business if you're.
Kate has raised her hand. Unmute yourself, Kate. What did you want to say?
Yeah, just one quick query. Have you got competitors?
We do. As I mentioned, a company called CNG Fuels. CNG Fuels do CNG. They do compressor stations. So it's a similar model to us, but they're supplying CNG. So it's a slightly different market segment, but both of us are competing for biomethane. There's a company called Vigo, who are relatively new to the UK, who are based in Europe, Germany, I think, and have started to put stations up. There were companies like BOC and Caligas who originally put stations up, but again, couldn't make it work. And they are what we call air gas. So they produce oxygen, nitrogen, this type of thing. They were thinking, well, it's a cryogenic liquid, therefore we should be in that business. It is a cryogenic liquid, but what it is more fundamentally is it's a fuel, and they're not in the fuel business. And you need to understand the different dynamics of the industries to do that. So they've backed away. But it's early days. There will be more people because it's a good business, and that'll be a new phase for us. We'll have to deal with competitors. At the moment, not so many, but it's bound to come because, you know, people will see the returns and they'll start investing.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much indeed. I think we're all very much better educated now on the matter of biomethane and HGVs. Yep. I hope we'll all be going away and talking about it. But thank you very much indeed for your time and for a very, very clear and informative talk. Thank you.